Howdy everyone. Great to be here. It's a little early in the morning for me, but I love India and I'm kind of sad that I don't get to be there in person. So I'm glad that I get to do this virtually. So hopefully we'll get our way through. So first of all, I kind of wanted to give a little bit of background on what IEEE SA Open is. I'm hoping that the majority of y'all know who IEEE is. It's a organization that has over 420,000 members worldwide in 160 countries, and there's some really good IEEE communities in India that I know have many people involved in it. But what is IEEE SA Open? Well, it's an open source community and it's a platform. And the reason that we were created is because at first we wanted to support standards. So this project was actually started about 5 years ago, and it was started internally from standards, where we realized that for the next step of evolution of standards is we did need to start supporting things like open source software, open hardware, and open data. We didn't want to fall into the normal problems that a lot other standards bodies are experiencing now, which is where if you put it on GitHub, you can always take your data out, but you can't take your community back out. And then this other icon is for SourceForge. I don't know how many of y'all remember, but back in 2005, they had a big problem of insertion attacks. And so IEEE didn't want to be dependent on anything along those lines. And so we're using GitLab CE and adding a lot of different stuff to it. We're still, we're not forking or anything along those lines, but in fact, we're being very open and very contributory to the different tools that we use. But we did want to make sure that there was something where we didn't have to worry about those types of insertion attacks, and so that we could be safe and secure. So with IEEE and standards, one thing that they do very well at is governance. And there's a lot of different processes and things that we do and we do well. And so we thought that maybe we could bring that to open source as well. So first of all, we could use open source to help standards evolve faster. At the same time, we could help open source become a little bit more safer, a little trusted, getting to production readiness and having some of these interesting tools to measure that type of progress. And then, of course, we want to take care of all the legal stuff because, IEEE is a 501c3 and very focused on humanitarian causes. And so making sure that all the different projects are following a lot of different guidelines and rules in regards to antitrust, intellectual property rights, export control, open source licenses, and really healthy community practices. IEEE has a pretty rigorous code of conduct, and we'll talk about that a little bit in regards to the role diversity, but bringing all of that in as well. And then the other thing that we're doing is we're doing it 100% open source. And what does that mean? Well, that means we're contributing up and down and across. And so what do I mean by up? Well, you'll sit there and see that there's a bunch of tools that we're using that are already open source. So first of all, we only use open source tools. Secondly, if we do have anything that we change within them, we always contribute it back up to those original open source tools. And then also we're in the process right now of open sourcing our infrastructure as code so that if you wanted to deploy something similar, you could. And then also we're encouraging other entities to do that. And then we're working with them to make sure that if they develop something new, they can bring it back in without having to fork or things of that nature. And I'll go into a little bit of that as we talk about the role diversity. So the platform itself, we like to think of it as community in a box. We've got 3 main things now. There's a bunch of other stuff in the works. The main one is GitLab CE, for doing your open source software. We're also doing Mattermost for chat and integrating that in with GitLab and Big Blue Button, and then Big Blue Button for doing the video aspects of it too. So we do have a platform evaluation process that we're doing that's all open, and we're doing it in conjunction with the community. And so here you can see some of the other tools that we're looking at and figuring out how we're going to integrate and make those available to the community as well. And then one of the reasons we chose GitLab is because it has all of these features. I think the 2 that I'd really like to stress is CI/CD. The CI/CD on GitLab is very good. I used it both for Hyperledger and some other different things that I worked on. It's a very robust program. In fact, I did tell them when I was working at PayPal that I kind of stole some of their interface for, when we were doing the orchestration tool for it. So it's a very intuitive, easy to use piece. And then also microsites so that we can make it easier for the documentation aspects. And then with Mattermost, once again, because it's open source and it has all the different things so that we can secure it really well. Same for Big Blue Button. We can be much more GDPR compliant. And it's got a bunch of extra features too that we really like a lot, such as the shared notes, which is kind of like a internal wiki type format, and the whiteboarding so that you can actually go over different pieces together as a community. And then once again, I like to show this because it kind of shows like how water is constantly recycled. Basically, any new features that we implement on the platform, we share them with all instances of the platform, and we share them back up to the originating source code. The other thing that we're also doing on here is we're looking at a standardization path for the platform itself and the different things that we're asking for people to do on the platform. And so we kind of start from the whole idea of subject matter experts first, and we do documentation, and then we templatize it, and then we automate it, and then we measure it and evaluate it. And then from then we can go in and create a standard from it. So let's get into the meat, which is the diversity aspect. And this all comes into the play as to the fact that it's both a platform and it's a community. And as you can see, it's kind of a nascent platform right now. We got these three things, that's good, but we've got a lot more coming. And a lot of those things have been suggested by the community itself. So why create this in the first place? Well, to support the standards. The standards had things like they needed open source frameworks, they needed open data sets for things like training and results, they needed, be able to do the different specifications and hardware, all of these different aspects. And so it's like, oh, we need a platform that we can start to customize so that we can support all of those standards that we're doing. And then we're like, hey, IEEE is huge. We've got all these communities. We've got all these societies. Why don't we help them out with it too? And so, for example, talking to ComSoc Bangalore, they're wanting to do a codeathon, a hackathon. And so it's just kind of like, yeah, come on in, use the platform. Now you've got a place to put your code. You can deploy it if you need to. You've got a place to do a website, you've got a place to have chat, and you've got a place to do your videos. So here you go. And then the other thing to remember is IEEE in America, it's a special type of nonprofit. It's called 501c3, which means businesses get tax deductions for donating to it, which means it's highly regulated because, American government wants its money. So we do a lot of humanitarian projects, and we have a very big focus on that. And one of the things that we were noticing is that oftentimes open source groups that are trying to do humanitarian projects with nonprofits aren't always great at software development. And so by creating these different structures, we could help them and nurture them and possibly even fund them through our platform. So we're doing a lot of work in regards to that. And we're doing a lot of work to evolve the platform itself to support those special needs, both of the community and of the technologies themselves. So with open source, when we think about it, we think about collaboration, flexibility, transparency. And then from the standards perspective, we're like, how can we introduce in some of our peer review models? How do we do some of that? Not the one and done aspects, but something that's continuous, so instead of just having, kind of like how documentation has evolved to be living and continuous and things of these documents, the same sort of thing is what we're looking at here. And then of course, affordable, if not sustainable. So when we looked at role diversity, we realized that, the current open source model isn't what we needed. Right now, there's a huge focus on maintainers versus collaborators, and that's all who really gets the love. And that's a problem because most open source communities that are really robust and are doing really well actually have a lot of people involved in that community. There's people out there tweeting about it. There's people out there writing documentation. There's people doing talks about it. There's people, helping with social media. There's people helping with design. There's people in the background product managing. They're completely unsung heroes out there. And so it's like, oh, well, how do we do that? How do we give that back? And also the biggest one for us is the users, those nonprofits, those special interest groups. How do we make sure that they are included into what we're doing? And so this is what we looked at it from that. And we decided one of the easiest ways to do that was role diversity, which is basically, we view it as being a gateway drug into inclusion. And that way we can create products that people want, and we can be more sustainable and have longevity. So Harvard Business Review has been talking about diversity for a long time and doing a lot of studies on it. If you go and look, they've got 20 years worth of it. And they've shown very consistently that, one, you get better products out of it. You have less abandonware, there's less burnout, there's less biases, there's less tribal knowledge. And what do I mean by tribal knowledge? I mean all that stuff that's locked away into a few people's heads that you can't always get to. By going through and doing some of these different aspects and creating diversity, you can't have those things locked into their heads, because then other people can't understand it and it's no longer inclusive. And then also it creates less toxic communities too, because people realize that they start to impact others. And when they do that, they realize, oh, maybe, doing some of these behaviors isn't the best decision. So it's also shown increase in innovation, increased productivity. You end up having much larger communities. You have much better long-term documentation, and you get clearer communications. But if you notice, I put clocks here on this slide. And the reason I did that is because it does take time and there is effort involved in it. But in regards to scale, it ends up working. So, one of the questions that I would like a lot of open source groups to ask themselves is, if they're not inclusive, are they actually open? If you don't make things friendly and make it so that other people can come in and participate and contribute and help things grow on a larger scale, are you actually open? It doesn't feel that way to me. Also, remember that diversity does not mean inclusion. Diversity means that you're simply expanding the scope. Instead, you actually need to look at what you mean in regards to inclusive. And that's one of the funny reasons why we focused on roles instead of some of the other markers of diversity, like race or age or geolocation or whatever along those lines, is because of, instead, we wanted to make sure that we had something where everybody felt like they had a place. And once again, I'm going to refer to those Harvard Business Review studies, where they found that roles and certifications helped a lot of the disadvantaged minorities, because of the fact that when you came in, you automatically knew, what the expectations were. You had a certain level of expertise. There was a big focus on a lot of that. And so they found that when you have those roles, it actually helps women and minorities. It doesn't hinder them. And I think y'all have experienced this in India too, where a lot of times you have to go into some place where no one knows you, no one knows anything about that. And if you can prove to them that you've done these different things through things like having done the previous role or having a certification or things of that nature, it allows you to get over that boundary. And so that's one of the reasons why we went for role diversity instead of trying to focus on the others, is because we felt that it highlights those benefits more and gives a better way of being more inclusive, not just diverse. And so there's some basic rules for the inclusivity aspects, right? One is go where they are. So here I am, 2 o'clock in the morning, virtually, yes, but hopefully still going where you are. 2, respecting the differences between the different cultures, especially when you're bringing things in and you're being inclusive. Marketing is not the same thing as development, which is not the same thing as management, which is not the same thing as the nonprofits and the users and the special interest groups. They all have different ways of looking at things. And you really have to respect that. You really have to be careful about vocabulary, because what means one thing to another doesn't mean the same to another. And you really have to understand that. And then the tooling. So one of the things that we're working on right now is that tooling aspect, because, for example, we are pursuing marketing and design. Well, there's not many open source tools out there for marketing and design. It's kind of painful. So we have to figure out how we work with them. And so right now, they're talking a lot about making sure at least that the content is open and is in some way standardized, so at least it can be used in different tools, even if the tools aren't open source. And looking at stuff like that. And then there's the locations. And so that's one reason why we are centralizing in a way, is so that way everything is findable and you can sit there and see all of those different aspects. And then the other part is evolve with them. If you just sit there and you bring in inclusive, you're bringing in diversity and things of that nature, and then you don't change anything, that's not inclusive, and you're going to lose them just from burnout alone. So you really do have to focus in on that and going to where they are and making them part of that process. And one of the things that we're doing a lot with is measurement. And I feel like one of the reasons so much open source software has been, dev to dev, is because of convenient data. Because in GitHub and others, it's easy to sit there and say, oh, we've got so many lines of code, we've got so many pull requests, we've got so many commits, so this is what's important and this is how we do it, and da 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 da. In fact, I was even at the open source summit in Seattle a few days ago, and there was a person showing us all these important graphs, and there were all these spikes on the graphs. And then she was talking about how she had to dive in to figure out what those spikes were. And that's because you're measuring convenient data. If you were measuring all of these other types of data, you would know what those spikes were without having to dig and talk to people and figure out what that thing was. If you were actually having all of that data, you would know these things, and you would be able to reward people and give them the credit that they need and deserve, and can sometimes justify their work at other companies as well. So we've got some big end goals with what we're trying to do with our platform, which we're looking at things like sustainability. We're looking at creating higher quality. We're looking at funding, seeing if something's fundable. We're looking at reuse and accessibility. We're looking at safety and ease of use and scalability. And so there's a lot here that we're trying to accomplish. And we wouldn't be able to do any of that without role diversity. There is a reason businesses pay for all of those people to have all of those roles, and it's not for fun, right? It's a very serious reason. And so we're trying to duplicate some of that in the structures that we're creating. So how are we doing it? Well, the very first thing that we're doing, I'm going to go into a lot more detail, and it's all very meta at the very beginning. It's basically going through, what are each of these roles? How are we defining them? What do they need in the platform to get support? How do we do this piece? How do we do that piece? Things of that nature. And then the other thing that we're doing is collaborating. So we're going out and finding all of those other different groups that are doing pieces of that around the world and saying, hey, have you seen what we're doing over here? We're going to do some writing some of this up. Like I said, there's that whole path to standardization. It's like, come on in at the beginning, please. Are you a subject matter expert? Come on over. We want to work with you. Are you a group that's doing that? Come on over. We want to work with you. So we've been doing things like collaborating with Red Hat on the Open Source Way 2.0. We're collaborating with the Chaos group in regards to metrics. We're creating, we're just running around finding all these different groups and collaborating with them and saying, hey, you're doing something cool. Do you want to come over here? And create some best practices that possibly we could standardize off of, or at least automate. So here's our community architecture right now. And what we've done is we've created these different advisory groups, and these things do map to roles, and I'll go into them a little bit more in detail. But I just wanted to kind of show you what the landscape is looking at. We also have over on the side the open source committee, which reports to the Board of Governors and Standards. And they're the ones who are also making sure that the platform is, keeping that eye towards standards, so that when we do things on it, they can still always do the things that they need to do to create standards as well. So, and then the other three groups, one is the technical advisory group. And that's what you're probably used to seeing in many, medium to larger size open source projects. But we took it to a meta level. And so it's like, yes. Okay, we'll talk about, good ways of you creating a technical steering committee and what your maintainer's manual should look like. And, how do you create your contributing agreements and all that? Okay, yes, definitely that. But let's look deeper. How do we actually get to that production ready quality that we talked about? What does that look like? And to do that, we introduced some roles that aren't normally given a lot of love in the open source world, such as large scale architects, security, the hard job of the middle manager to the product owner, and then of course the designer. And going in there and having all of those different groups being able to have a place and a say. And right now we're very focused on this other meta level aspect of it, which is the features and tools. And so they're going in and actually creating those processes. And I'll show you that in a little bit. Then you have the marketing advisory group. And this is, it's a little bit of a misnomer because it's a lot more than that. As you can see, there's events, there's the metrics, there's open source intelligence and research. And of course, there's how to market and there's PR. And then you have the community advisory group. And this one, was even more of an experiment than marketing was. This is the one that's kind of like, it's the users, it's the nonprofits, it's the special interest groups. It's the heart of mentorship in regards to our community, and so that's where our diversity and inclusion group lives. That's where, we're talking about badging is actually starting here. And then it permeates into the other different groups to sit there and say, oh, what does a project badge look like? What does a community badge look like? What do all of those different pieces look like? And then also, how do you do documentation well and things of that nature? So it's a very interesting group. And I'll talk about them more in just a second. So when you go to opensource.ieee.org and you sort it alphabetically, you'll get all the numbered groups. And the numbered groups are basically those meta level groups that I was talking about. So you have welcome, which is like where everybody starts. And if you notice, we've got those 3 advisory groups. And within those 3 advisory groups are all of those subgroups that we talked about and all of the content and all of the different stuff that they're creating in their meeting notes and the recordings of the meetings and all of that type of information. And then you have the sandbox. Then you have the OSCOM one as well. And you have the sandbox. And then we've also got some stuff for how we're going to handle archiving and deleting projects and things of that nature so that we don't have a lot of abandonware on the platform, because our focus is different from GitHub. There's reasons to go over to GitHub and not to come to us. Our focus is if you want to have a certain maturity level and you need a certain level of support, and especially if you're doing anything with the IEEE, of course, but also humanitarian projects. Anyone can come and start a project, but we're not really there to help support corporate entities. That's not on our agenda, and that's not part of our goals as being a nonprofit organization. So we're kind of focused on that humanitarian cause there and, the impact for making the world a better place. So the community advisory group. This one's really interesting. We end up getting a lot of managers and a lot of leaders. But one of the key elements that I noticed that kind of bubbles out of all of them is there's so much facilitation that goes on. And I feel like a lot of times that's really missing in open source, and it's kind of unsung because that there's always that person on chat that's always like, oh, that greets everyone when they come in and answers questions. And, it's basically this wonderful ambassador type of personality. This group attracts those people and brings them in, the teachers, all of those types of people. And so we talk about, how do we create a positive culture? How do we do this inclusion and this role diversity? What are all the different aspects that we can do that? And then they have a bunch of the special interest groups like education. And the education subgroup, which first started out as academia, but then some K through 12 people came in and they're like, oh my gosh, we should expand this. We should call it education instead of academia so that we can address all of our needs. And then there's the marketing advisory group. And like I said, this expands out and they're doing other different things like, so first of all, they are doing best practices for all the projects in regards to, here's a social media toolkit and a template for it. here's, some other ways that you can think about doing, how to work well with a designer, things of that nature. But then it's also stuff like, oh, we have an event that we want to advertise, or we're speaking at something, or we want to share our slides that we created about this product, or we wanted to do any of those different things. They can come in here and they can do that. And we're figuring out ways of measuring that, hopefully without being too intrusive in regards to it. And so that's what the OSINT group works on a lot, which is the open source intelligence. So they're always sitting there going, oh, how do we do this so that we don't like invade people's privacy or do anything evil or things of that nature. And so they work on that a lot, and they're talking about those kind of practices as well. And then lastly, we have the, but not least, we have the technical advisory group, which is the group that probably most of y'all would be the most familiar with if you've been doing open source for a while, except we've added a little IEEE standards flavor to it, such as, we're starting a group on architectural reviews and code reviews and best practices in those, and how we look at all of that for that, so that we can both implement it ourselves on the platform and also have tools and other things for anyone else who implements their own product or project on the platform. And then they've also been doing a lot of work right now on the platform itself in regards to, how do you propose a feature to add to the platform? How do you propose a tool? How do we decide which open source tool to choose over another one? Things of that nature. And then also even the logistics of it, because a lot of this stuff exists on the IEEE IT cloud. And so it's like, how do we work with them and their security requirements and things of that nature? And then also, how do we lock things down and get closer and closer to that production readiness? So one thing that was really cool that happened is, we're watching this features and tool evaluation group, come into being and creating all the different processes and working with the team to do that. But one of the neat things that happened is the education subgroup went in and did an entire evaluation of the platform as a whole and sat there and said, you know what, this isn't good enough. We need these things. And so then they took their so they did a bunch of research and they took their presentation over to the technical advisory group and said, hey, how do we do this? And they're like, oh, here, let's write up some documentation explaining to you how the feature request process works, how the tool request process works, and let's start going through that. And they've been like evaluating those processes together. And so they're saying, oh, well, okay, this makes sense, but we don't understand what this is. Oh, could we have some more information here? Oh, maybe we need to step here. Maybe we should talk about how to create a matrix for comparing features on different open source tools, or, things of that nature. And so it's been very, very collaborative and quite heartening to like see happen. And then we've got the marketing advisory group, which I said like is doing a lot of different things. Probably the most active is the open source intelligence group, where they're working on best practices and methodologies, but they're also looking at the tools and the resources and things of that nature. And of course, they've kind of got like a big lift to do, because most people aren't aware of open source intelligence. They're not, they haven't figured out how to go through and do these kinds of reviews and find this kind of data. And even, one of the things that sometimes pains me is sometimes people will go and invent an open source project without even Googling first. It's like, please go search first. Make sure that there's not an open source tool that's already there doing the exact same thing that you're trying to accomplish. First go look at the other ones, do that, figure out how you can collaborate with them and move forward. And so they're doing that, but, to a whole other level in regards to how you can find that, where you can sit there and see where those things are, and also how you can evaluate people to bring into your open source project in your community to grow it past where you're at currently. So we've got a bunch of stuff that's coming soon on the platform. One, which I will assume will be near and dear to your heart, is we are working on a bunch of stuff in regards to globalization. So we're looking at some different tools to help. One of the ones that we're doing a proof of concept on right now, haven't approved it yet, but we're looking at it, is Nextcloud. Why? Well, the education group and the marketing group brought it up. So the marketing group needed spreadsheets and slides, and then the educational group needed easier to collaborate documentation, because doing pull requests and commits and all of that on a documentation when everyone's trying to do it live isn't great. And many businesses and countries are locked out of Google Docs. And so we're like, oh, well, if we implement this ourselves, we host it ourselves, we put it on the cloud, we can even do regional clouds, we won't have to worry about that lockout. So we're doing that. And then the big blue button for the meetings and the recordings. So that way the meetings can be done whenever you need to. Everyone has access to it. So it's not a money issue. And then also with the recordings, it helps a lot for when things are in different time zones. So that at least you can go and watch the recording and then have a bunch of commentary in the chat afterwards, even if when you aren't, necessarily in the same time zone or always up at the same time. And then we're also looking at, for all those tools, how we can get localization in so that we can support multiple languages and things of that nature. When I was at Hyperledger, it was interesting because too often we had a lot of work that was happening in China, and they were left out a lot because of both the time barrier and the language barrier. But once we opened up chat integrations with WeChat, and then we opened up the localization issues in regards to translations, the interconnectedness just exploded because they basically went in and translated a bunch of things, and then they could go and work on the different things with their language and then translate it back for everyone else. And then with the chat integrations, we could sit there and see, oh, there's actually a lot going on. We just didn't have any visibility into it. Well, I did because I was on WeChat, but not everybody else was. And so we did a lot of work like that to do that. And that's the kind of stuff that we're looking forward to doing for IEEE as well. And then we're also looking at other ways of doing asynchronous to help support the time zones. And sometimes that does mean, you might have 2 different meetings to help support them, but figuring out different ways on the meeting notes and the agendas to still stay coordinated with one another, even when, we don't want to stay up late at night. So the next thing that we're doing is open hardware, because we're IEEE. We got a lot of hardware stuff. And so one of the first things that was done for the platform was Plant UML, which, is a diagramming tool basically to help support some of the open hardware standards. And that was done very quickly. We're also looking at, how do we do better diagramming in regards to some of these different things and the versioning of that and stuff, with those graphical interfaces that you need for, things like chip design and things of that nature. And also, what's the impact to CI/CD for that? How can we do this better? And so I posted a link here from FOSDEM where they talked about how they wanted to do continuous integration for open hardware practices. And that's one reason why I talk a lot about the continuous documentation and the continuous all of these different pieces, because we're going to need that to be able to support things like open hardware. And then we also want to support open data because, once again, IEEE does a lot of publishing. There's a lot of science. There's a lot of academia involved. And on those standards, they wanted things like training data sets and resulting data sets and things of that nature to be incorporated into those standards. And when you get into open data, things get a little different. You do have to worry about privacy. You do have to worry about security. We're looking at doing a bunch of different integrations. We've already got Dataport at IEEE for helping with some of those large data sets. And we've also been doing things with CodeOcean for doing those types of implementations. The problem is CodeOcean it doesn't evolve well. You can't grow much. It's more about doing that one and done of publications. And so we're going, how do we integrate with that? And what do we do about that? And that's on the plans for next year. And then also, of course, integrations with publishing itself and figuring out what is open, what isn't, and how we can move forward on that without, bankrupting a nonprofit, which we don't want to do. We want to be sustainable as well. And then we're looking at a bunch of other open source tools out there, like Ribose has something called Glossarist, which is great for doing open glossary definitions for hardware. A little bit too probably finicky for open source software, but just exactly what you need for open hardware. So I wanted to invite y'all to come in and join us. First of all, come join the community. I just showed you all these different ways. So no matter what you do, there's something that you can contribute. Even if you're not a developer, even if you're a user of things where you're like, what would be really cool? You can request features. You can talk with the designers about, what your true needs are. And if you're a designer, you can help those people who have those needs and those desires to be able to communicate them better to the developers and things of that nature. So, first we're starting off with this meta level with all of these different roles and aspects. Then, of course, you can come in and use the platform for coding. You can, bring in a project, start working on it, doing things of that nature, go for it. Especially if you're doing something that has a humanitarian focus. And then we're also working on a bunch of adding those things to the platform itself. So we're automating a bunch of different processes. Like we hope to be automating soon, like in Big Blue Button, you have these shared meeting notes. So why not at the end, not worry if anyone copy and pasted them into GitLab, but have them automatically post to GitLab. Same with the video recordings, things of that nature, which is also an important part of antitrust compliance as well. So it's got dual nature, makes it easier, and we don't have to worry about the compliance issues as much. You can also come and share your own feedback too on the platform, because it's all evolving right now. And so any of y'all can come in and sit there and go, oh, it would be cool if we had these things, or, things of that nature. You can also come and develop a standard. Come work with us there. There's so many standards happening. And right now we're trying to figure out which standards need the open source aspects that we're doing of software, hardware, and data. And then of course, you can create your own community over here, because when you do create a group in a community, you get chat, you get all these different aspects to it. You can do a website, you can do all those different things. You could also sponsor if there's any businesses watching. We do workshops and videos and different features. And so we have different plans for people to come in and donate and sponsor those. And in fact, we're even working on a larger picture for next year, where we're trying to figure out a resource allocation program with IEEE Foundation, where you can donate money to the foundation. And we're talking to a bunch of other foundations about this as well, too, for these humanitarian projects. And then what we do is we go back in and we evaluate, and we go, oh, you know what? You really need a security audit. That's going to be probably around, at Hyperledger, they're anywhere from $50,000 to $250,000 a piece. But it's blockchain, so it's a little complicated. And so it's like, oh, well, let's go do a security audit for you. That'll be, something that's probably outside of the budget of many small open source projects. Let's do that for you. Or, oh, you're having some problem with marketing. Let's see if we can help you out with that as well, and, assign a resource for that and things of that nature. And so we're looking forward in regards to that. And then of course, you can always contribute to the platform itself. So the best thing to do is go to saopen.ieee.org. That's the website, which, we are eating the food that we cooked in regards to that, in that it runs off of GitLab. So on GitLab, we've implemented pages, which means that you can go through and you can create documentation and things of that nature for your group and your project. And for those, we've got two static site generators that we've used. One's Gitbook, which is like really super simple, rudimentary kind of thing. And the other one's Gatsby. We're working right now on a lot of the documentation for Gatsby, because it's not as easy, but you can do so much with it. And that's one of the ones that a lot of the other groups ask for, because they have like the scientific notation libraries, the mathematical libraries, all of those different aspects in there too. So when you do your publishing of your documentation, you can really do it. And for further links, there's saopen.ieee.org, which is the website, opensource.ieee.org, which is the platform, which isn't the friendliest place to start from. You should probably go to saopen first, look at all the getting started, and then hop over to the platform. And then once you've created your account on opensource.ieee.org, then you get access to the chat. And that's where a lot of stuff goes down, honestly. A lot of people are typically on chat talking about things first. And then, and so there's a lot of interactions that happen between people on chat. And then, of course, you can always email me at sbonewald@ieee.org if you need any additional help. We also have office hours. So if you go to saopen.org and check that out, if there's not a time that's convenient for your time zone, let us know on chat and we'll schedule one for you. So that if you need help getting onboarded onto the platform, or you have any questions or things of that nature, we're here to help you in regards to that. And we'll do special things to help with that. And you can also find me on Twitter. I'm just Silona on Twitter, Silona. And I'm very active on there. So especially in regards to conversations. So if you at me on Twitter, I'll respond.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thank you, Silona.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you, attendee.